Today's topic, boundaries to manage expectations, is a vital topic for people of all age groups. Every single day, I hear people say they're overwhelmed, they feel taken for granted, they're under too much pressure. I wonder if we understood what boundaries are important to us and how to use these to manage expectations, whether life would be different. Would there be less feelings of resentment and guilt towards the people we love the most? Dr. Maria Kempinska, MBE, my guest today, is a psychotherapist, the creator and CEO of a comedy club, and a radio presenter. Welcome to the chat, Dr. Maria.
Anshu, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And you're looking fabulous, by the way.
Thank you, as are you. And thank you for being on our chat.
Always.
I'm going to start by asking you, what is a boundary to you?
You know, it's such a fascinating question because the answer is quite short. A boundary is a line, almost a line that we can't cross, shouldn't cross, or that actually we should respect. And there's also a boundary called liminality in philosophy. There's a man called Victor Turner, who wrote about liminalities, the space that we do use as a boundary, that we cross over into another space that gives us, that we recognize as a space for crossover. And that is like when we go to passport controls, that's liminality, that's a border that we cross. But boundaries are those that we have that are, number one, for ourselves, our personal ones. And we know that when we're feeling discomfort, we might be feeling a little bit tense around somebody. There's so many feelings that come up with our own personal boundaries, but there's also family boundaries. Then there's cultural boundaries, social, legal, political, business. And in our world, and as we were talking about it, everything is changing at the moment. So these boundaries are changing practically every single day. And at the moment, we are in a major global shift. So not only are more people integrating, which I absolutely love, I love to know new people's religion, the depth of their feeling and understanding, the depth of their history that comes with them. But also religion comes with boundaries. Mm-hmm. And religion was that personal boundaries that was given to us in order for us to regulate ourselves. Now, I'm not here to talk about religion particularly, but it has been said a number of times that the politicians and policemen of the world cannot regulate society if we don't have our own means of regulation. And our religion enables us to regulate ourselves. It makes us question ourselves if we're clever about it and not just rebelling against a cultural norm. And this is where it becomes confusing. If you've got one culture trying to integrate with another, and the two cultures for some reason are not gelling, which happens, then you've got conflict. And people often rebel just for the hell of it, just not to integrate. So there's many areas, but I think we're going to start with personal boundaries, which is, I think, the best place to start.
Yes, and the way I look at a personal boundary, it's like a contract that you sign, sort of mentally sign or emotionally you agree on between two people. And you need to know what you want as your part of the contract, just like the other person needs to know what they want on their part of the contract. And unless you know that and put that down somewhere, somehow, there's no way that the two of you are going to know that.
But do you know what I love about you saying that is that it's so crucial. And when people get married, that's what we try to do, isn't it? We try to set we say, I love you, I will love you forever. I will love you through the good times, the bad times, ill health and wellness and so on. But the reality is the rest of the boundaries, unless you both come from the same cultural background and the same religious background, that's where people forget to set their boundaries, forget to set what is basically, which you do, as you said, in business, you always set contracts. So perhaps we're moving into a world where more contracts will come into play in everyday relationships.
Yes. And I guess a way that people have already started doing that is prenups. Yeah. I mean, that's to do with wealth and money, but that's a way of already putting in this contract. So why do you think is it important as a psychotherapist? Why do you feel it's important to have or to set boundaries?
Because we are complicated. Every individual person that is on this earth, although we might look similar,
right.
And we might have other people that you think, oh, she looks like my friend, or as you do, you look like a very good friend of mine, and it's lovely because there's that familiarity, but underneath it, we are immensely complicated as people. And not only do we have our relationship with the outside world, we have an internal relationship. And I'm a great believer in our spiritual nature and our soul's purpose. So I'm a big, not just religious believer. I like people's religion, the good bits. I don't. Right. I think punishment is useful, but I do believe in the soul's purpose, and so on. And internally, we have a lot of dialogue that goes on internally, and we often beat ourselves up. So in my therapeutic practice, it's setting up the difference between what goes on inside us and what happens outside. I'll give you an example, actually. You might quite like this. And this is in, I've trained in everywhere. So I've worked in mental homes, I've worked in asylums, I've worked with the homeless, I've worked in all sorts of places. But this I read somewhere when I was being trained, and it was a story of a 4-year-old boy, and he was playing with a bow and arrow. And as he was shooting the arrow outside on his lawn, a milkman was going past, and he was shooting it at the milkman, just at the cart, to see if he could reach the cart. And the mother came out and said, Johnny, don't do that, because you could hurt the milkman. You could shoot at the milkman and hurt him. 2 days later, it just so happened that the milkman died. The little boy was mortified because he believed that he had shot the milkman and the milkman had died. Do you see? And so there's an internal world. And the mother, once she realized that there was a problem with the child, he was a little bit anxious, he wouldn't go outside to play. She then had to find out why he wouldn't go out to play. He said, have I hurt the milkman? Is it my fault? Oh my God. And she said, no, of course not. It's a mistake. But what happens internally with our internal dialogue is what they call the fantasy world, PH fantasy world. And that's the world where we make our own assumptions of what happens in the world. And that's why communication is so important. Otherwise, we can get lost. And there's a lot of people who are becoming delusional. They're becoming a little bit paranoid because they're not communicating properly. Or, and I really think we should talk about this at some point, drugs. Drugs relinquishes that boundary between what we know and our own boundaries and the rest of the world, because sometimes, and people are taking more and more drugs, those boundaries they dissolve, they've diluted. And the difference between where am I today and what's happening in the other world, it has a cloud over it. It has a mist over it. And so people don't know whether they're saying the right thing. They forget what they say. They misinterpret people. So if we do that without drugs, that's why I don't think drugs are very healthy, but just on that level, because you forget people, you forget what you say. So there's so much confusion.
But coming back to boundaries and personal boundaries, I feel like boundaries are quite contextual, because what's accepted, say, in one country, like the country, say, take my example, I grew up in India. What's acceptable in a country like India may not be acceptable here. And what's acceptable in India in today's day and age may not have been acceptable 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So, and with a lot of us living, working globally, traveling globally, being brought up in one culture, living in another culture, how does one navigate this? how do you feel people can deal with living and working globally when exactly what you had mentioned at the beginning, when cultures are getting mixed up and intermingled very nicely, but people are getting more and more frustrated with how to deal with this and
Yeah, I
with
do.
families?
Absolutely. I think you've got to come back to your own family and see what the rules are there. When in Rome, do what the Romans do was the greatest saying. So when my parents are Polish political refugees. When we came here, I spoke Polish at home, English outside, and there weren't many Poles here. And we had a different set of rules at home than I did outside. So I understand that. And then when you travel, of course, some people are more strict, like you don't put your feet up you don't show somebody the bottom of your feet, or how you hand your business card over. There are many, many rules or expectation. In some cultures, they have the ability to marry a number of women, or some women until recently weren't allowed to drive cars, and so on. But it was always different for the Westerners. However, when you come home, I think once you've been open to other people's sort of loose boundaries or their tighter boundaries, and these are laws that they have, then you come home and you have a different expectation. And I do think we are crippling our young people here because there's so many different rules, not only for whether you're Indian, whether you're Polish, or from Africa or from Far East. The British rules, unless they're defined, people don't know where they're going. The biggest problem is social media, because social media have their own rules. So young people particularly, and anybody who's in the media like yourself, you'd be looking at, the Twitter or the things that you must engage with to feed your audience. And yet people will be allowed to say things that they wouldn't ordinarily say. And this into the minds of young people. And that is where I think we're becoming, there's a major problem, for young people and other people, because I don't think there are many people who can take the torrent of abuse that comes through social media. But also then, how do you regulate your home life? How do you stop your young people from using the tone, using the language, using the rudeness, actually, the disrespect that happens, in social media, in their home life? That's very difficult for parents, I think. And I also think it's difficult in relationships.
So when you're talking about some cultures, there's parental relationships, and then there's relationships when you get married. Not just, there's relationships with your husband, with his family. And then you're talking about, those could be very different boundaries as well. So I think the fact that we're beginning to have conversations around this is absolutely vital, because I think it's going to help a lot of young people as well. And I hope it does. But there's another issue that I wanted to raise. And that is that when there is change, like there clearly is now, there's always turmoil. So when you're trying to explain, sometimes when you're trying to explain your boundary to people around you, and they might not agree with that, there is turmoil and possibly conflict. So how much conflict do you say one should be ready to deal with in order to set your boundary?
Now, Anshu, I know you're in business, and I really believe this is where business actually can be very helpful. So if you are in a business meeting and there's conflict in the business meeting, you set the agenda, and it's almost like setting the agenda, a softer agenda, let's say. Let's talk about these things. And if there are issues that come up that are too heavy, can we put them aside for later? Because let's find what the main focus is today. And the clarity of thought, and I know you're a scientist by background, and I think you have got that immense clarity of thought. And I think setting those agendas at home are so useful. And I say this actually to couples, who are you together? What works for you? What doesn't work for you? Let's put those into a sort of love bubble, your love heart, of the things that work for you. And let's talk about the things that are difficult as well, but end up in always start and end with a loving term. I think which you wouldn't do in business, but you could be kind, because you've got to aim for something. Always remind people where they're aiming for at the beginning. That may need to be something that everybody has to be reminded of. But in a relationship, it's, I love you, darling. We have some things we need to talk about. I don't want this to upset us. And if it does, can we put that to a side? Let's think about it and come back to it. But some things will fester. There's no question, because it's home, it's painful, it's hard. And that may be because it brings up a whole plethora of experiences. If you've been ignored, if nobody takes any notice, if you're a woman at work and people ignore you, which let's say still happens, there's still fewer women in the boardroom than men, and they still shout over.
No, absolutely. And you know what? Like, to give you an example, I always make reservations for us as a family when we're traveling, and I would do it in my name, and people automatically, when we walk into a hotel, they would look at my husband and say, "Oh, Mr. Anshu Bahanda, welcome to the hotel." And I'm thinking, it's Mrs. Anshu Bahanda, it's not Mr. Anshu, that his name is something else.
I know.
But they always think it's in my husband's name. So and no matter where I'm traveling, east, west, the first thing they do is look at my husband and, assume that the reservation's in his name.
It's so interesting. And I quite like that. And I think that's very funny if you can keep a sense of humor about it. But it depends how painful that is. It depends the pain that has gone with your experiences. It also depends on how your husband treats you.
No, absolutely. And I'm lucky enough that he respects me as my own person. Otherwise, a man who was less confident would have a problem with that. But he's confident enough to not let it bother him. He just laughs.
Yes, that's fabulous. But if there is a husband who feels less confident, or if the wife is brighter, cleverer, smarter, sharper, faster thinking than the husband, there may be all sorts of problems that wakes up inside them, and off they go to the hotel room. And there's another problem once they walk in the hotel room, because he doesn't defend her. He doesn't actually announce that it's her. He doesn't protect her. And so we come to the issue of gender. And I think gender is an issue, is something to contemplate globally. And I'm not talking about transgender. I'm not talking about changing gender. We're here. That's for totally another occasion. But we're talking just about how men treat women. And it's quite interesting, this debate that's happening. And I do think men physically mostly are stronger. And there are times when women are being violated and men need to step in and protect them. And I think that ability to protect, it's like a woman gives birth, she's vulnerable at that moment. And the father is there to protect the mother. So it's almost like the pearl is the baby, the mother is the shell, and the father is the one that protects that. I think that's a good image for people to remember. That's what the masculine, the strength of the masculine does, protects his wife, his child from the outside world. It doesn't mean it diminishes her. It actually protects her. And to recognize the sacredness of that action, the mother, it's such an amazing, powerful being that she belongs willingly to him, with him, and the baby is theirs. And that's what the father does. And I think that's really powerful. So if you come to that image, and when people get married, when they understand that image, they can change. It often changes their perspective, actually, about the whole relationship.
Yes. And I love your analogies that you use, because it makes it so vivid. What you've said about the pearl and the oyster, that's lovely. That image is a really beautiful, powerful image. But when it comes to boundaries, now I want to discuss two issues here. One is when we don't set our own boundaries, or we don't ask other people to respect them, just because maybe we haven't thought through it. Maybe we don't know enough about it. And the second issue is when we're trying to set our boundaries, but other people don't respect our boundaries, even if we've expressed it. So these are two separate issues. So coming to the former, could it be possible that the environment we're used to, or that we're used to people pleasing, or our desire to be appreciated or accepted, in the process, we let people violate our boundaries, or we don't set our own boundaries? What is your analysis of that?
I think that's such a good question, because there are so many people, mostly women, not all, that have been trained, if you like, by watching their mothers and their grandmothers and so on, to be the pleaser, to be the one that cares for the family. Then suddenly they say, well, actually, I don't need to do this anymore. What about me? And often there's this whole thing about women going to a spa for a day, but it's not that. It's the recognition of who you are. And do people recognize who you are?
Exactly.
And I think witnessing... It is.
Sorry, I was just saying it's a way of being.
Yes. And I do think that I've had these conversations with women, and I do think that sometimes it's almost announcing it, but how do you announce it? When do you say it? And sometimes you can be tongue in cheek and be humorous with it. This is another one of my fabulous dinners. This is what I've done today, aren't I wonderful? And I do think women do shy away from telling others how amazing they are. And I do think we women need to tell each other how amazing they are, and we are to each other.
Yes,
and women
absolutely.
Don't do that. And once you get used to that and saying, no, it's okay that you can be beautiful. No, it's okay that you can be smart and beautiful. No, it's wonderful that you are this person. From one woman to the other. Now go home and tell your husband. And almost the only other way you can deal with it is almost by ignoring somebody, unless they ask you in a certain way. Oh, did you mean to say it like this? Did you mean to say this? So it depends, at what point does it get into an argument? At what point does it become something that's ignited? Because sometimes, let's face it, it's only when you get angry do people listen. And anger, there is a righteous anger as well. So not all anger is bad. I really believe that people should understand not all anger is bad, but very often it's still put to a side when a woman gets angry. Oh my goodness, mummy's getting angry. Or my wife is angry at me. Oh, isn't it terrible? But sometimes if that's the only option, it's saying that and then saying, I need to talk to you about that. I don't want to get angry, but you don't listen to me. I need to explain this. And only by understanding yourself. But if one woman can tell another woman, do you not see who you are? And do you not see who I see in you? So it's important for us as friends to say to somebody, you're such a brilliant thinker. Look at the way you think about things. I would love to learn from that, because we can't see ourselves. And if women are at home, they don't see themselves. Men often go to work and they write a CV, something, and they know, oh, this is who I am. This is how I present myself. But if a woman is at home and nobody tells her the expectation, we women have to tell her, who are you? How do you think other people perceive you? Is it very good?
This. I love empowering other people. That's what we try and do at Wellness Curated.
Yeah,
not just
absolutely.
women, just empowering people, because that's who we are. By empowering someone else, we empower ourselves exponentially.
Yes, totally. But also, it's a great way to enhance and encourage cultures to integrate.
Absolutely, absolutely.
By seeing the best in other cultures, by finding what is that. Everybody has a nugget of gold inside them. Mental health often, I think, has a problem because they search and talk about the negative, but very often the negative, what Jung called the shadow, hides as an element of gold. I called that golden nugget. The Greeks called it the daemon, the personal genius. And we all have something. And often our mental health problems can be hiding our personal genius because we're too afraid to show it. I can't be brighter than my brother. I can't be brighter than my father or my mother or somebody else. But if
I can't earn more than my husband. You find that even in the West. You find that everywhere.
Yeah. So whatever the issue is remember that not all mental health problems stem from something being wrong with you. There could be something very right with you that you just haven't seen.
Right, right. That's interesting because, yes, that's very interesting. So you're telling me all boundaries don't need to be negative. They could also be positive.
Very positive. And it's in our words. Our words are boundaries, you know, because we often feel things. I'm sure you do. You send, you know, you're a very spiritual person. I know that. And you might walk into a room and you feel something, but it's not until you put words to it sometimes. It's those words that are the boundaries to our feelings. What have I felt here? Is it intuition? Right. Am I feeling bad feelings from somebody, or are they feeling bad feelings themselves? And I'm picking up on their depression, or I'm picking up on their discomfort. So it's not necessarily about me, it's about them.
Right.
You know, so our words themselves are so powerful.
Yes, absolutely. And coming to our second issue, not respecting other people's boundaries. So I feel like when you respect yourself, you know, and you respect someone else, even if you overstep your boundaries by mistake, once you're reminded about them, you try and pull yourself back. But when you don't respect yourself as a human being, when you have low self-esteem, that's when you purposely overstep people's boundaries. That's when you purposely, you know, we've seen that like in generations and familial relationships, when there is a problem themselves, that's when they suppress the younger generations.
Yeah, that's such a big problem, Anshu. Such a big problem, because what you're talking about is not only the explicit, the things we recognize, but it's the implicit, the things we don't see, the invisible expectations, the invisible laws that have been laid down that could have happened, you know, sort of in our generation that we just don't talk about. And for example, I know, you know, I've had clients where that young person becomes the mother to the rest of the children. And it's such a weight on that young woman.
Yes.
It doesn't fall to the man, but there's something instinctive about women that we do that is gifted in that way. So it's how do we recognize that, oh goodness, this is a gift, I am talented, as opposed to a burden. And that comes from the other people outside. But as you say, it's us recognizing the other is so powerful. And I think those boundaries, if you overstep them, it's, as you say, it's bound to happen. It's how it's done. It's how far does it go? But I think, you know, let's touch very quickly, although we're not going to go into it too much, is the sexual boundary. Right. About when you're touched, how you're touched. I think everybody needs to be very clear, if you're not in a relationship, even if you are, at what point are you being touched? By whom? Where? How? When? And so on. If it feels wrong, it is wrong.
And Dr. Maria, that's something that needs to be explained, I think, by every parent to their children, because otherwise it causes problems later in life.
Yes, so every parent, as you say, needs to address their children, what they're showing others. And this comes back to, who am I? What am I presenting to the world? We've never had to do this so much. We've got to be so aware of our individuality. So let's be quite clear about this. A 13-year-old girl went to my children's school. She was wearing a see-through blouse. That's a message. You can't wear a see-through blouse with a bra at 13 at school. It's telling people something. Right. You know, it's the wrong message for herself as well, because she's over-sexualizing herself at a very young age. And it's not saying don't be aware of sex. It's just being aware. You have to be aware of what it means to others. If you're walking home alone at night down an alley, you are actually vulnerable. It doesn't mean that you want to be vulnerable. It doesn't mean you want somebody to do something, but you're vulnerable. Or if you go back to somebody's room at 2 o'clock in the morning, a hotel room, you're vulnerable. Now, I do know that they say, oh, men should be, or, you know, certain people should be more aware and shouldn't overstep the mark. But equally, you're overstepping the mark because there are certain boundaries. And we all overstep those marks, sometimes as teenagers unwittingly, but sometimes willingly. And then we realize, oh my goodness, that is what happens. Our parents did tell the truth. They did know. They weren't just, being strict. They did know that there are certain boundaries that we must follow. And it's very difficult for young people because in the UK and in the West, anything goes. And I think this is quite dangerous for young people because they don't know, they're not warned. They're not given that defense. They're not being protected. And I think this is the biggest dilemma we've got at this moment in time.
So any tools that you can recommend that will help people set their own boundaries and follow other people's boundaries?
I think communication is crucial. Expecting your children to not listen to you as a parent, how do you make them listen to you is by your own standards, is by showing them your fear for them as opposed to berating them. One of the best things I did with my children, if they said they were going to be at home a certain time and they weren't home, I used to call them and say, oh my goodness, something terrible must have happened to you. Because you said you would be home at 10 o'clock. You're not here. So something terrible must have happened. And once I did that a few times, they always used to call me because I thought I was a bit rebellious. I thought if I come down hard on them, they won't listen. So how do we set our own boundaries? By our feelings, our visceral, we come up with feelings. If we come up to somebody and you feel there's something wrong, the way they look at you, the way they touch you, these are instinctive, almost primal feelings that will tell you there's something wrong. Walk away. Rather than get involved, walk away. And there's a wonderful book called The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. And it talks about fear being the most wonderfully protective gift we have. If you're fearful of something, tell somebody, call your parents. Look, I'm stuck. I need to get home. I know every child wants to be in charge. Every adult wants to be in charge, but sometimes we're not. And those
So you're saying listen to that little voice inside you.
Absolutely. And that voice may have very various tones to it. It might be, oh, I'm just not sure where I am, or he's gone too far. But there may be a deeper, fearful tone. And you've got to get out, jump into a cab, your parents will pay. Get out of the situation or call your parents, call for protection, ask for somebody to help. Actually, there's something I did want to add before we finish, and I know we're coming to the end, Anshu. Suicides. I know this is quite extreme, but if you think that somebody is on the verge of saying something or doing something extreme to themselves, ask them, are you about to harm yourself? Are you in a harmful situation? Are you going to harm yourself? Don't be afraid to ask those questions that often we think we're too sensitive to ask. But if you think that you've got somebody around you at school or a friend who is in a vulnerable situation, don't be afraid to ask the direct question. Are you going to harm yourself? Do you harm yourself? Only then can you actually get a honest, reasonable answer, because often people who are in that very vulnerable state won't tell you, and only by a direct question will they answer. So where we often pussyfoot around to be sensitive and sort of not upset somebody, the direct question is often the right way to ask somebody, to actually break that barrier that often we feel as if we're overstepping a boundary, but it could be the right time to do that.
Yes. And for this, I guess, we also need to sort of build emotional intelligence into everyone around us to know when is it important to overstep that boundary. Like you said, not all boundaries are negative. It might be positive overstepping that boundary in a situation like this where you could actually be saving a life.
Definitely. It's so powerful.
Okay. Any other tools for our listeners?
I think what's so crucial is to say no, to give space. So if you're on the phone or if you are in social media and you are listening to people, turn it off. put it down, walk away. Walk away from your telephone occasionally. Don't answer everybody so quickly. If you are the person that is the type that is always wanting to include people and you're not being listened to, the best way you can protect yourself is silence and space. Actually, it's really handy in a relationship as well. Sometimes arguing is just not the right way. People, when they're heightened in their emotions, won't listen to you. So as much as it is like holding on the reins of a very wild horse at times, isn't it? If you're in that moment and you've got to say your piece, why aren't you listening to me? The best thing you can do is to just take a deep breath if you can and walk away. I know people say that, but just hold back, take a deep breath, hold back and walk away. Go and do something else. Go outside, go and start cooking, go somewhere else. Take time, take space, take a deep breath. Don't reply. Let the other person calm down. Because if you are both ignited, and it is like fire on fire, I like the elements, you know, you have to become like water. Right. You have to go away. You have to sort of dissipate the feeling. You have to calm those, you know, that fire. And the only way you can do that is by walking away. And I think the elements are a great image for us, you know, because some people can't control themselves. Some people need to be right. It doesn't mean they are, they just have to be right. So for us, it's by knowing ourselves, can I take this? Is it worth it? Is it worth the argument? That's what you should say to yourself. What are those questions you ask yourself? Can I take this? Is it worth it for me to get into an argument at this point? What is it we want to achieve here? And it's almost like stepping back and saying, oh, what is it exactly we're trying to achieve? What has gone wrong here? If we can. That's why space is
I'm going to call that your 2 S's, Dr. Maria's 2 S's, silence and space.
And space. They're very so powerful.
Yes, very powerful message.
And it's hard to do, so I take my hat off to people. But practice on your phone calls. Practice if you've got somebody that's in distress, you will answer very quickly. When that distress is gone, you don't have to answer so quickly. But somebody else might be used to you answering quickly. So start practicing with people that you don't need to answer so quickly. And say, right, just take your time before you answer. If you are the type that responds to others all the time, see what it feels like not to respond. And that doesn't mean you're not caring. You can respond by saying, I'm doing something, I'll call you back, just so that they know, but also give it space. Because it also gives you time to think, actually, what am I doing here? Sometimes people are so giving all the time.
Absolutely.
You know, I've got to make sure this person feels good. I've got to make sure that person, but just give a text to say, I'm sorry, I can't talk at the moment. I will come back. But it gives you time to work out, should you come back? At what point and what do you say?
Thank you, Dr. Maria. That was an incredible chat. And I think we're going to help a lot of people think about boundaries to manage expectations. So thank you for being on the chat.
Actually, it's such a pleasure. And thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. And thank you, everyone, for listening in.